Hello, and welcome to what is actually the second attempt to film this. And I did actually complete the first attempt, and I was quite happy with it. And then I started thinking about all the various things which could be necessary, which could be useful to put in. And I decided very quickly that, frankly, it wasn't enough. Because this one I've covered before. I've covered the Battle Atlantic before. I've talked about it in anti-submarine warfare. And I've talked about in the sort of the Convoy War and the PQ17, and I've talked about it in Small Ships to Big Missions, and I've talked about it in all sorts of different videos. And honestly, it's still probably going to be the most contentious of the videos of this series. Because there are going to be people sitting there going, oh, shouldn't this have been amongst Churchill's schemes? Well, it's not, because I'm not talking about it from Churchill's perspective. I'm talking about it from the German perspective. And the German perspective is different. Because I'm talking about the pursuit of the Battle Atlantic in itself and the German strategy. Now, there are some things you have to remember with the strategy. First of all, Donitz wanted a force of 300 submarines to carry out any operation, to carry available, should he be called upon to carry out such a submarine, such an operation. In reality, when war begins, he has 21. His idea for the 300 is that 100 would be on operation, 100 would be in transit or coming back, and 100 more would be in refit working up, because you don't ever have a third of that force actually available for operations. So this is why he wants 300. The Germans build hundreds of submarines in World War II. The trouble is, there are three things working against them. One, Allied anti-submarine technology, of which we can talk about centimetric radar, we can talk about Enigma, but honestly, ASDIC is one of the biggest factors. We can also talk about the Spigot and the Hedgehog mortar systems, and we can talk about the fact that versus depth charges. But again, depth charges are not a bad system. They're not as effective as we would like, and they require one ship to maintain contact with ASDIC while another ship goes across. So they have to work in pairs rather than one ship being out to engage. But it works. It does work. This is German submarine strength. And there's also tonnage up there. And that's the interesting thing. Because German submarine strength doesn't get to 100 at sea until late 1942. So 3 years into the war. Now, it does peak at very nearly 160. But you'll notice that peak is in 1943. And if we look at it, the Germans get 0.6 million in 1939. Okay, well, most of 1939, they have barely 20 submarines at sea. And then 1940, they managed 2.3 million tons. But again, that's barely 20 subs at sea. Sometimes it's near close to 40, but still, it's barely 20 subs at sea. 41, it drops down and then starts to climb as the numbers of submarines at sea start to climb, but that's still 2.2 million. And then 1942 is when you have enough submarines at sea, and it builds up to getting to 100. But you also have enough experienced submariners at sea, submariners who know what they're doing. And if we go back to this thing, these the graphs from the anti-submarine warfare slide in the Convoy War PQ17, you can see that there is the tonnage sunk by U-boats and there is the various U-boat sinkings. And you'll notice U-boat sinkings are starting to go up. There aren't that as many sinkings in 1940 and 1941, but there are a lot less submarines around. And the point is, the U-boat sinkings keeps going up and up and up. The numbers of submarines at sea starts to go down. And so does the tonnage being sunk. The question is, why? If submarines are so powerful and potent, and they are powerful, potent. There's a reason the Royal Navy has them. Every Navy has them. They are very useful things. Why aren't they winning? The Germans are pouring everything into their submarine arm. They are pretty much, by this point, 1943, 44 onwards, they've given up on their surface fleet. As near enough makes no difference. They are pouring everything into their submarine arm. And where is the victory? And here comes the ultimate problem. I can always build more of these than you can build submarines. If you have two nations of the same maritime infrastructure base, and they are starting a war, and one pursues an entire submarine strategy, and the other one goes for a mixed strategy, i.e. some submarines, but also some escort, by also a lot of escorts, they will always be able to outbuild the submarines of escorts. And that becomes a problem. Why can they outbuild submarines of escorts? Well, let's consider the numbers. The Germans would build close to 700 of their Type 7 submarines, the most common and most critical submarine for their forces in World War II. Yes, other submarines are better and more advanced, more niche, but it's the Type 7s which are the backbone of their force, and that's what that big surge in numbers really represents. But they never have that many in service because they're getting lost. And the thing is, a submarine gets damaged, it goes down. It's very, very hard to get a submarine home. A damaged escort can be towed home often and make it. A submarine being towed on the surface by another submarine, that's just some sitting targets. They might make it, but it's very unlikely. And if you're operating further away, then you need to have some milk cows, those submarines which are designed to resupply and refuel other submarines. So that takes away even more from your operational strength and your capabilities. So yes, I have a submarine operating out there, but it's not one I want engaging a convoy because it's rather valuable as the sustainment submarine. So you're losing submarines, you're losing experienced crews. And whilst the Royal Navy and the various allied navies are losing escorts, they're also building huge numbers of them. And remember, the Royal Navy starts building trawlers in 1938. There is 112 of the Isles class alone built. All in all, requisitioned and built trawlers in the Royal Navy probably account for not far off 400 ships. In fact, possibly over 400 ships. Now, not all of those can do a transatlantic crossing, but they can do a lot of work on the coastal convoys. Then you have the Flower-class corvette, of which the RN builds 225 to the original design and 69 to the modified design, and there are 33 lost in World War II, of which 22 are to submarines. The Hunt-class escorts destroyers. There are 86 are built, 23 are lost, roughly half to submarines. V&W destroyers, of course, the World War I builds, like the four Pipers, which also get used and given over triple Pipers or four Pipers, the ones from the Americans. Sorry, I've been dealing with teenagers all day. Brain might be a bit of a lot. They are old World War I era destroyers, but they are converted very quickly to long-range Atlantic escorts, in large numbers, and they're very useful for that. And then you have the River-class frigate, of which they originally planned 30. They built 151, and 5 were lost in World War II. 5 were lost in World War II. And there's, of course, the Lock class. There's all sorts of classes of escorts being built by the Royal Navy. And, of course, the technology, Castle-class corvette, and the technology just keeps getting better for them. They do get the centimetric radar. They have far better ASDIC. They have they've got that plethora of depth charges, but then they get the hedgehog system, and that's the all sorts of systems eventually get added in. They get all sorts of developments created, and they become a far, far more capable ship. They become a far more capable design. I'm going to keep calling the squid mortar the spigot mortar, so I will apologise. It happens occasionally. Brain dies slowly, and then it remembers and goes, oops. They are building up their escort force. And so let's consider the escorts versus the submarines, because that's really what you're talking about. The submarines don't know where, even without Enigma being a factor, and Enigma, of course, is a factor in how they route the convoys to try and avoid the submarine wolfpacks. The submarines go out not knowing where the convoys are going to be. They've got a best guess. They've got a best idea of where they're going to be. And they do try their best. The escorts know where the submarines are going to be. They're going to be around their convoy. That's the thing. They can hope they'll avoid them, but they're going to presume they're going to be around their convoy the whole way, so they're going to be alert and watching for them. They might be there, they might not. The point is, if a convoy gets across without being molested and without being attacked, they're fine. They're happy with that. That's a win for the escort. If the convoy gets attacked and they sink some submarines, that's also a win. It's easier to replace escorts, but they're also far more less likely to be lost, because what are the submarines hunting? The submarines are hunting the merchant ships. Yes, they might go after the escorts, but the escorts can maneuver more easily, they tend to be shallower draft, and they tend to be faster. So they tend to be far more difficult targets than the merchant ships, which are also the U-boat's primary targets, because they're trying to starve. It's economic warfare. They're trying to crush the British economy. They're trying to blockade Britain by submarine. But the whole point is, this is, in many ways, a single focus of attack. And as things start to develop, you start to have escort carriers coming in, you start to have air cap closed and all these things. It makes it certain. But to be honest, the Battle of Atlantic was decided in 1938, when the RN ordered the Flower class. The moment the RN and the Allies, even though they're not being called the Allies, are ordering cheap, numerous escorts that they can produce in large numbers and they can surround convoys with, you're in trouble if you're pursuing a submarine-based, a single-dimensional attack strategy. Because that's what the Germans do. The Battle of Atlantic, as a submarine operation, is a crackpot scheme. Yes, they come close. They do very well. Yes, they sink a lot of ships. But I would argue it never gets as dire as we might perceive it to be if you read certain accounts. Because, yes, it felt very dire at the time, but there was always enough supplies to make it through, and enough supplies did make through, and thanks to Enigma and various other things. But even without those, you have well-defended convoys, and you have the submarines being forced to fight in the middle of the Atlantic, where they cannot safely predict where the enemy are going to be. Because the closer they get to shore, the closer they get to the British aircraft. And that's another problem. You have aircraft searching for you. And these are not the submarines we have today. These are, and honestly, before we get into it, the whole idea of modern submarines carrying out a modern battle Atlantic is kind of interesting, because if we think about it, yes, merchant ships are larger than they used to be, and a lot less numerous. But their size and compartmentalization, especially of, let's say, something like a container vessel, means it actually becomes quite difficult in a way to sink, unless you use a couple of torpedoes. And then you run into the problem of, how many submarines do I have, and how many torpedoes do they carry? And once again, where are the ships? We might be using satellites, but there are ways to interfere with satellites. All sorts of things become parts of the war. The point is, the Battle Atlantic as a single focus strategy in terms of submarine warfare makes it far easier for the British to win it. The British have, and after World War I, the British, French, and other allies spent a lot of effort in making sure Germany doesn't have a significant maritime naval infrastructure. One classic example of that, we look at their capital shipbuilding program. It's build a carrier or a battleship. It's build 2 Scharnhorst. Maybe you could get a third, but probably not. Once they're finished, then lay other ships down. You're not able to do a multi-ship production. You're not able to do what Britain does and basically churns out light fleet carriers, and even some battleships at the same time. You're not able to do what America is able to do, which is massively increase their infrastructure and put lots and lots of stuff down and sort of start building and churning it out. Germany doesn't have the space or the ability to do that, thanks to the legacy of World War I and the way the Allies have dealt with their infrastructure. It would have taken a lot of effort and a lot of money to reverse that infrastructure base, and a lot of time. And the German leadership in the 1930s didn't want to supply any of those things. They wanted the status of a powerful navy, and they didn't really want to pay for it. So the Germans are forced into a submarine-based strategy, which is great. Britain has far more maritime infrastructure and naval infrastructure than they have. They're able to churn out escorts and in corvettes, trawlers, in all sorts of yards which have no impact on their main production. And they're able to churn them out in Canada, America, all over the place. And that's great, because those escorts don't have to be as numerous as the German submarines in order to have an outsized impact on the German submarines. But when they are as numerous as the German submarines, and at certain points they really are more numerous than the German submarines, and especially as the war goes on and gets further along, you have real problems for the Germans. Because you have convoys which have more escorts than you have submarines in your wolf pack. And here's the classic issue. This is the 14th of August 1941. This is 80 years ago on the date this video will come out. Look at where all their German submarines are. They're the orange ones. This is from U-Boat.net. A lot of these slides have been from U-Boat.net. They're lovely and they're wonderful in terms of their graphs and their detail, and it's one of the best sites to go look this stuff up. Especially if you didn't bring the book with you on your research trip, on your teaching trip. You can see where the wolf packs are. There is a small one down in the Bay of Biscay, and there is a large one just south of the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. And yes, those are critical shipping routes. But here's the problem. There's also a large amount of blue between that. And those lovely labels are far outside compared to the reality of those submarines able to see the area around them. And by 1941, you have all sorts of things beginning to enter service, as we talked about earlier. 1941, this is a banner month. This is when the submarines have quite a lot, and the Germans have quite a lot of U-boats out at sea. It's great. What are they achieving for all this? Well, if we go back to here, we can see in August 1941, they have, well, at various points, 40 submarines out at sea. They will sink 2.2 million tons. But in August 1941, they will also lose about 6 or so submarines. They sink some stuff, but the British are building. The Allies are building. And remember, we're not that far off December 1941 when things get really bad, because America goes from Lend-Lease, we're your friends, but we're not in the war, to in the war. You've already got Canada churning up. You've got India, Australia, New Zealand all churning up. You've got a battle raging around the world in many ways, because you have German submarines and Italian submarines trying to do other things, and German surface raiders have tried to do some other things, but the battle has actually started to condense into the North Atlantic and Mediterranean, which is again good for the British. At this point, the British are doing fairly well. Yes, they're not on the continent, but maritime-wise, they're able to concentrate on things. They're able to work out, hang on, we need to concentrate on building the ships we need to fight in the Mediterranean, to fight the Italians, and to fight the Germans. And we probably need a force we can deter the Japanese with while we're doing this, so we need to do some building for that as well. But thinking deterrence versus fighting a war in the Pacific is a very different matter. So the Battle Atlantic comes down to this idea, if we get back to the original point of this, of whether it's a crackpot scheme or it's something which is badly executed. And when we're going to talk about Donitz later on and what he really thought on his birthday, we're going to get into this more, because the strategy of it is simple. We deny the sea to the British. But in order to do that, you need to be doing a layered approach. If the Germans had built Scharnhorst with 15-inch guns and built 8 of them, yes, the odds are the King George V would have been 15-inch gun battleships. In fact, they would certainly would be. And the odds are the British would definitely not have paused any carrier construction program. In fact, that would probably be accelerated. If the Germans had built 5 or 6 Scharnhorst and built a couple of finished off a couple of Graf Zeppelins, as I call them, these are variations of the Drachenfeld plan, where the Germans, instead of building the 11-inch arm Scharnhorsts, build them straight up with 15 inches and then just press repeat, which they could have done a lot quicker than transitioning from one to another with their infrastructure. Yes, those vessels wouldn't have been possibly as good as Bismarck or Tirpitz in some ways, but they could have had a lot more of them, which would have been a lot more problematic, because if they'd had been able to send out 3 of those with 15-inch guns and an aircraft carrier to be one of the task forces of Norway, that would have been very problematic if Renown had run into them. Renown would have probably ended up having to run away instead of them running away from Renown. It would also probably cause the British to be far more worried about conventional warfighting, which would have meant they wouldn't have been able to put as much effort towards building escorts. The reason the British make the order for escorts in 1938 is they're looking at the tea leaves of the Germans, and they've already worked out, hang on, if they go to war with us, they're going submarine-centric, so let's just start churning out those escorts. Because the British know from World War I, even if when they didn't have Enigma and all the other things, if you have a decent convoy and you have a decent escort force for your convoy, you can do a lot of damage. You can do a lot of damage to your enemy submarine force because they have to come to you. And because the moment they start firing, they lose their element of surprise. And yes, I know during the beginning of the war, something that scares the surprise the British is that the submarines are actually coming on the surface through the center of the convoy, because they didn't think anyone would do that. And then there's a whole discussion, they work out it's going on, and suddenly you start having the merchant ships getting more guns provided for them. Some of the merchant ships have guns, but also you tend to find you have a loitering flower class or something sitting in the center of the convoy somewhere. And when a submarine runs through, it goes, I'm on the surface, I'm going through, boom, boom. Oh, fudge. Because for a submarine, being on the surface is actually dangerous. It's daring, it's brave, it's very high risk, because the submarine has no armor, and the pressure hull gets damaged, they can't dive. Or if they do dive, so this all comes down to the Battle Atlantic is not a good idea for the Germans. It's not a sensible idea for anyone to pursue with a submarine-only force. I'm not saying submarines shouldn't have been a critical part of it, and I'm not saying it wasn't the only and the best worst option for the Germans, and sometimes that's the strategy you have to go with, the best worst option. I'm saying that they would have been far more capable of a balanced force if they'd been able to produce them. If they produced Panzerschiff, which could actually stand a chance of outrunning a battle cruiser, or at least going fast enough they couldn't be outrun and turned circled around by one of them. Because let's be honest, Deutschland class HMS Repulse would have had a field day with them, let alone Renown after she'd been refitted, or Hood. The Germans are looking at a Battle Atlantic, and they're going with the strategy which worked for them best last time. But the trouble is they don't have the maritime infrastructure to actually create that strategy properly. And that strategy, unless they had a superior infrastructure to the British, would never really work for them. It's the basic logic in the case. In which case, you ask yourself, what should the Germans have done? What strategy should they have gone with? you have two options. You either go with a defensive submarine strategy where you basically use submarines to block off the area around your coast as an extra layer of the Atlantic wall, or you go commerce raider but actually surface commerce raider viable, i.e. you produce something not too dissimilar to the Manxman class or the Abdeel class fast mine layer the British had. So, i.e. a cruiser capable of 40-something knots, armed with maybe some 6-inch guns, but pretty much designed from the waist up, from the hull up, keel up, as a very fast, long-ranged, quick hitting vessel. Something you can also churn out in large numbers. So you could combine that with your submarine force. And you could use that along with your submarine force to really cause the British trouble. Because especially once you got control of Norway, such vessels could have raced out. Honestly, the small cruisers and submarines combined with aircraft, and I'm talking long-range aircraft, would have stood the best chance. But honestly, and I know there was a bit of a jump there because I had to go away, so I hope it makes sense. Honestly, there isn't much the Germans can do after World War I, after the way their maritime infrastructure and naval infrastructure has been decimated. And let's build that up. And again, if they had started building up their infrastructure, if they had been building up their infrastructure, the British would have seen, everyone would have seen, and everyone would have reacted. So the Germans are in a catch-22. They're damned if they do and damned if they don't. Again, though, if you're interested, if you go with a light cruiser approach, you claim they have heavier armor than they actually do, and so you claim they're slower than they actually are, and shorter range than they actually are, you could achieve something. And I'm talking about something which is about probably a town class equivalent. But instead of treble sixes, double sixes. And probably 3 of them, but the same size as a town class, with the same amount of horsepower as a town class, and a lot more fuel. Probably carrying more rounds per gun than the town class E as well. But it would even out because they'd only have 6 guns. As said, speed of roughly 40 knots would be necessary. So, Abdeel town class sort of combination. But honestly, the Germans are in a similar bind to the Japanese. The Japanese have limited space and limited infrastructure, especially if you're trying to sustain a navy at that level. And again, we're left going back to the Italians, who are the only ones who have decent-sized infrastructure for what they want to achieve. In fact, for what they're wanting to achieve, they have very adequate infrastructure to build it. And honestly, the reason they don't have a more capable, rounded fleet is more down to decisions they've made in procurement than their infrastructure limitations. So, that's the Battle of the Atlantic. It was a bad idea from the get-go. And what have we got coming up? Well, as I have recorded this on a separate date and have announced them now, the winners of the Patreon vote for August, we have Patreon 30, Under in Oz, Japanese hybrid warships World War II, worth building on a waste of resources. I think you know the answer. I'm probably going to come up with that one, but I might, well, surprise you with some nuance. And then Patron 31 on 26th of August. Calvin Gasberg's Armored Cruisers in the Mediterranean, which will be correctly spelt by the time it becomes a thing. In World War I, actions, losses, kills, and impact. Interesting. Armored cruisers get forgotten, but I would say in many ways they're the forerunner of the heavy cruiser. I'm still considering doing one of these, which is entitled Why the Battle Cruisers Should Have Been Called Frigates. Why that was Jackie Fisher's mistake. Because if they'd been called frigates instead of battle cruisers, well, the world would have been very different. For starters, they might well have been their own separate category. In the treaty system, because they wouldn't have had the battle, so they might not have been linked in with the capital ships. They probably would have been, but you never know. Because they are frigates, not battleships. In which case, you could have ended up with a very interesting, different treaty system where you had limitations on the number of battleships you could have and the number of frigates you could have. It was then aircraft carriers as separate categories. And just think about the world that could have been. Anyway, thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion, and I hope it's interested you. Once more, I'm going to go through the slides in large so you can see them again. We had the first slide taken from the Convoy War and PQ17. Links to those 4 videos are down below in the description. Then we have the Battle Atlantic and the tonnage figures. These come from U-Boat.net. This graphic, it's really, really cool, and it's part of their whole discussion. Again, a link to it is down below. The big Battle Atlantic slide. I rather enjoyed this one. And the locations of U-boats on the 14th of August 1941. Again, thanks to something which is really interesting about U-Boat.net. This is a new birthday present surprise. Give people birthday presents, which is what were U-boats doing happening on the relevant day for their birthday in a particular year. I'd say, whatever relevant year you can pick. If it's this year, 80 years ago, what were they up to? And remember, suggestions are open for September, so please go get them. And as ever, thank you to everyone for watching. Thank you to everyone who likes. Thank you to everyone who comments. Thank you to everyone who takes the time to think about these videos. That's what I aim for. And then thank you to everyone who's joined the channel for the emojis in the chat. There is, as you saw, there are plenty of lives coming up to use them. I do feel apologetic for this last couple of weeks, but honestly, I can't plug it in any of the sockets around here. They all seem to go wrong every time I plug something into them. And also running a live with teenagers running around here and having to look after them, that doesn't seem like a sensible option. Not when I'm working. And thank you to everyone who's a patron. Between all of you and those who do super chats and those who watch the videos and see the adverts, you really are funding my research. It's kind of interesting. This is the first time I've been back doing this work for a while since COVID began. It's going to be useful, but honestly, I'm going to be using this money to just sort of restock other areas, and it's the research which wouldn't be happening and wouldn't take place into things like sloops, etc., without your funding. So thank you very much for your support, and I hope you're having a nice day and hope you enjoyed this. Take care.